What is accommodating resistance? Accommodating resistance is where you have a bar set up where the further you movement, every inch that you movement, you're getting more resistance from it, whether that be from band resistance or chain resistance. Every inch that you move that bar, it's getting heavier and heavier. It's most frequently used with bands or chains. My best way to do it for all the lifts, the way I prefer, is to use bands that are resisting you instead of assisting you. The difference between bands and chains is that chains are going to be linear. So every inch that you move that barbell, it may get 10 pounds heavier. So the first inch that you move it and the last inch that you move it, say it's only going to get 10 pounds heavier from each of those inches. So it's linear. Whereas bands, they function off of the K constant, or what we call the spring coefficient. So every inch that you move that bar, it doesn't get linearly heavier each inch. So the first inch you move it, it may add 10 pounds. That second inch you move it, it may be 15 pounds. And that third inch you move it, it may be 40 pounds. So the further you move it, the harder that next inch gets. So each of those have their application. Sometimes chains can be better because it's more linear. Sometimes bands can be better because it's not linear. It's going to get harder each inch that you move it. I also prefer bands because to me they're easier to set up. Chains are very cool, but chains also require a ton of weight to actually get a good training effect. And it's very difficult to set up a lot of lifts with truly heavy enough chains that don't make it too awkward between the swinging or the plates landing on them. And another reason that I like bands are because they're analogous to a muscle. So a muscle is like a rubber band. The more you stretch it, the more tension it puts, the more it wants to spring back. And if you stretch a rubber band or a muscle this far, there's not going to be as much added tension as the next inch. So the resistance profile, the tension profile of a muscle stretching is very similar to a band stretching. So training your muscle through a range of motion that is completely analogous and complementary to how a band acts is really good for training. The other awesome thing about bands is that if you have the weight of the bands and the barbell set up appropriately, you physically cannot coast through any sticking point on that lift. Meaning, if the bench press for you gets easier at that top half, and normally with free weight, you push hard off the chest and then it's really easy and you can just kind of coast and you get into a habit of doing that. With bands, you can't do that at all, because if you try to dial back how hard you're pushing, even if it is just habit and you're not intentionally trying to do that, with bands, you can't stop pushing as hard as you can that entire time or those bands will crush you. Chains are a little bit different because since it's a linear addition of weight every inch, you can still coast through the lift once you're past your sticking point. When to use bands? The most common place that you see bands used in the strength world is what we call dynamic effort work, which is made popular and really come up with by Louie Simmons of Westside Barbell. And the dynamic effort work is when a lifter either does 9 sets of 3 or 5 sets of 5 with bar weight that is less than 50% of their max and band weight that is around 75% of their max. So if you get those numbers correct, the bar is not going to be very difficult to move. It's not going to be a grind. It's not going to be a lift that you really have to grind through a sticking point and you're on the verge of missing it. It's not going to be like that, but it's also not going to be an easy lift. The purpose of the dynamic effort work is to force yourself to apply max force through the bar for the entire range of motion and do some shortened rest periods. Another time to use it, and it's actually my favorite way to use bands, is just variation. So you could set up a normal bench press, a normal deadlift, or a normal squat, how you normally would for your primary movement, and add bands on as an assistance movement. That's going to totally change the strength profile and the resistance curve of that entire lift, and it's a great way to enhance your weak point and really focus on strengthening your weak point. It's also good to use bands through injuries. So if you've watched the injury videos, you understand that eliminating painful ranges of motion are a way to continue training around injuries. Well, bands are also a way to do that, because a band is going to add resistance at the top of the lift. Whether you have bands working for you or against you, the further you lift that bar, the harder it's going to get. So if there's something, say in a squat, and I experienced this with my torn hip labrums, that bottom position of the squat hurt me very much. So one option was to only do a squat down to where the pain started. So I may only be doing a squat down to, say, 4 inches above parallel and coming back up. So I'm not exploring that bottom 4 inches of the squat because of my hip pain. Another way to do that is with heavy bands. So I could do a full range of motion with bands where at the bottom I may only be experiencing 225 pounds of bar weight, but as I go up, now I have 600 pounds at the top. So it's a good way to strengthen parts of the movement that are healthy and unload parts of a movement that hurt you. There's heavy and light bands, and there's a ton in between. So at the different ends of the spectrum, there's very ultralight bands that are thin, and at the other end, there's incredibly thick bands that are hard, and there's every size in between. So it's hard to say which is which, but we can put them into two buckets for all intents and purposes and call light bands and heavy bands. Light bands are great because unless you're really trying to overload the top of a lift for some reason, either because of an injury or you're an equipped lifter, and you're just looking for more of a strength curve that may fit your muscles, or to just chase some different accessories, light bands are great because you're not going to have a crazy big contrast between the bottom and the top of that lift. With a heavy band, you can have a tremendous contrast in the different resistance from the bottom to the top. Just for example, you may use a very thin light band on a bench press. At the bottom of that bench press, that band may only add 20 pounds of resistance and 60 pounds at the top. So you have 40 pounds of contrast from the bottom to the top. A heavy band may be set up where the bottom it still adds 50 pounds and at the top it's 150 pounds. So the contrast of bands in that movement is 100 pounds. So it depends on the purpose of you using bands or accommodating resistance to understand why you might want to apply light or heavy bands. One of my rules of thumb that I like for bands, and this applies to whether the bands are working for you or against you, is that there needs to be tension from the band for the entire range of motion. A lot of times you can see bands set up where if you're working against bands, that at the bottom of that range of motion, those bands deload and there's slack on them on the bar. You don't want that. You want there to be tension for the entire range of motion. And that range of motion is going to have the contrast in it. So at the bottom, you don't want there to be zero resistance from the bands. You want there to be some resistance from the bands. Using the bands can also get difficult in a power rack, especially for something like a squat or a bench, because the bands will be pulling down so hard at an angle that is inclined or different from the safety cups of the rack. So, you know, if gravity is working like this, the bands may be working like this, and you take that bar out, and the bands want to pull that bar and snap that bar out of your groove. So if you have mono hook attachments, that's great for squats and benches. Other than that, you need to be careful, especially if you're using heavy bands, on how to take that bar out of the rack without having the bands snap and pull that bar where you don't want. There's a million different ways that you can set up bands, whether they're choked, whether they're wrapped around different things. But the key is, like I said, you want tension at the bottom of the lift and at the top. You don't want slack in that band at any time. And don't get too wrapped up into calculating or measuring the resistance of the band. The best way I've found to measure the resistance is to use a luggage scale, and you can take that range of motion and find where the band is at the bottom and the band at the top, and find what the actual resistance poundage of that band is, both at the bottom of the top. But the reason I encourage you to not think about or look in too much to what that band is adding is because a lot of times it'll give you an overinflated sense of where your strength really is. So if you're doing a bench press, for example, and the bar weight plus the band weight at the top is 500 pounds, you're not all of a sudden a 500-pound bench presser. You might be a 350 or 400-pound bench presser. It depends on how much of that weight is bar and how much is band. But just because the weight at the top is the bar weight plus the band tension doesn't mean you can actually do that same weight through a full range of motion. So just be aware of what that's telling you. And I actually don't preach too much or don't harp too much on getting the exact right poundage of band tension. I just like there to be contrast from the bottom to the top. And the best way to measure that is you take either an empty bar or a bar with one plate on, you get your bands set up and you practice that movement, whether it's a squat or a bench, and you want to be able to feel a pretty drastic contrast from the bottom to the top. And if you can feel that with an empty bar, then you know you're on the right track. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways you can set up bands in a rack. There's a million different variations, and sometimes you just need to be creative. you got to remember that the heavier a band is, the more it stretches, the infinitely more resistance it's going to give you. So keep that in mind, because a thin and a wide band are going to be needed to set up different. So here we have an example of how to set up a band for a squat using a light band. It's hooked on this peg, runs under this peg, and then up to the bar. You can use the same band and change the resistance by moving this peg in. The closer you move this peg in, the less resistance there will be from the band, because it shortens the length of the band. In this example on squat, we have a slightly heavier band, and instead of making an L shape on the pins, it goes straight from the pins to the bar. If you're setting it up like this, one of the things you need to make sure is that in the bottom of your squat, that this band doesn't go completely slack. So if it does, you can change that either by wrapping it multiple times on the bottom, or even wrapping it multiple times around the bar. In this example, if you aren't able to have pegs on the bottom that you can use, you can just simply choke it on the power rack like this. And if you want to add resistance, you can wrap it around again for another choke on the bar. And all of these ways of attaching bands to the bar from the bottom can be exactly applied to at the top. This example of bands for the bench press was the same as it was for the squat. You can use these pegs to make an L and take the band up to the bar. If you want to do less resistance from the band, you would take this pin and scoot it this way. You could also choke this band on the bottom like we talked about with a squat, and change how many times you wrap that band around the rack. What you want to make sure is you're doing it equally on both sides so that resistance is same on both sides. This example on the bench is doubling over this thin band on each of those pins there. This way has the band stretched a lot more than it would if it was on an L or choked on the rack, and because of that, you're going to experience the end range of motion of that band. If you have a power rack like this, you can set bands up for deadlifts the same you would for squat or bench. Or if you have a deadlift platform with pegs on it, it's really easy to set them up there. If you don't have a power rack like this, or even a deadlift platform, there's still ways you can use bands for accommodating resistance on deadlifts. One method is just to loop a band over the bar like this and step on it, and you can do this both conventionally and sumo for deadlifts.